So I think we all know and understand that family relationships are really complicated. We all know this, we all experience this, we all have really close ties with people, whether we like it or not. And sometimes people are complex, and sometimes people make really bad decisions, or sometimes people have really weird traits that make them sort of an embarrassment to your family. Now, for that reason, pretty much every family has some kind of drama or tension in it. Most families have a family member that is excluded sometimes, or maybe even intentionally hidden. They may even have an incident that no one is allowed to speak of. There may be some embarrassing aspect of your family that you just prefer to keep private. Now, you probably don't have to go very far back in your family tree to find someone who has made some pretty shocking decisions. But family is family, mess and all, right? And today, as we continue our series called God of Our Fathers in the book of Genesis, picking up at the end of the story of Abraham into the story of Isaac and Jacob, we are going to see some pretty messy family history. As we talked about last week, these stories from Genesis are part of our faith heritage. This is our faith family's history. And we can look back on some of the mess of that history and not just learn things about who we are, but learn things about our God who is guiding all of these things. We read these stories, as we talked about last week a little bit, as true events. As we say very often here at Aspen Grove Church, we believe the Bible to be 100% true in its context and in its style. And the style of these passages in the book of Genesis is narrative style. It is telling us things that we believe literally happened. The information on its face, we take that to be literal information. Now, the distinction that we should make, especially as we get into this messy family story today, is that when we read these things, we read them as being descriptive, not prescriptive. A lot of the times that there's this temptation for people, especially when they read the Old Testament and the stories of these people, to say, how can I be more like this person? And we want to be careful not to do that. That's not always the point of the scriptures. We don't look to every individual that's talked about in the Bible and say, hey, I should be like that. And especially as we read the story today, you will see some traits that you should not adopt. It is describing things that happen, not prescribing behaviors for you to pick up. We can still believe this to be true and still believe it to be relevant to our lives without making the mistake of saying, I want to be more like this person. Does that make sense? We're looking at these stories instead of looking at great qualities of people and saying instead, what was God doing in this? What can we learn about him? What can we learn about his will by what is played out even in the mess of these family situations, even in the mess of our forefathers of the faith? So last week, we covered all of Genesis chapter 24, the longest chapter in the book of Genesis. We talked about how Abraham sent a servant 450 miles away to his tribe in order to find a wife for his son Isaac, the one chosen to father God's people. As you remember, the servant finds Rebekah, he brings her back to Isaac, and they are happily married in that cute little love story. And in all of it, the promise of God still stands. The covenant he made with Abraham will be upheld. All nations of the earth will be blessed by the nation that comes from Abraham. However, that doesn't mean that Abraham and Isaac's nation will be the only nation to come from Abraham. So look with me at Genesis chapter 25 for what might come as a surprising and messy development in the family story of Abraham. Look at verses 1 through 11 of Genesis 25. It says, Abraham took another wife whose name was Keturah. She bore him Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. Jokshan fathered Sheba and Dedan. The sons of Dedan were Ashurim, Letushim, and Leumim. The sons of Midian were Ephah, Epher, Hanok, Abida, and Eldah. All these were the children of Keturah. Abraham gave all he had to Isaac, but to the sons of his concubines Abraham gave gifts, and while he was still living, he sent them away from his son Isaac eastward to the east country. These are the days of the years of Abraham's life, 175 years. Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people. Isaac and Ishmael, his sons, buried him in the cave of Machpelah in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar the Hittite, east of Mamre, the field that Abraham purchased from the Hittites. There Abraham was buried with Sarah, his wife. After the death of Abraham, God blessed Isaac, his son, and Isaac settled at Beer Lahai Roi. Okay, these are the portions of the Bible that you may tend to skip, especially with all those names that even I have a really hard time pronouncing sometimes, right? These genealogies trip us up sometimes, but this one is particularly confusing for a couple of reasons. Let me explain kind of where we are. Let's get oriented here just a little bit. First of all, understand this section about Abraham's descendants and what comes after are placed into the narrative right here to mark a transition in the story. What that means is this. Now the story is no longer about Abraham. His chapter is closing, and it is moving on to focus on Isaac and his son Jacob. So this is put in here not at the chronological moment that Abraham died, but rather just to stop talking about Abraham and start talking about Isaac. Understand this, Abraham lived, as it said, 175 years. You may remember that Isaac was born when Abraham was 100 years old. Then we read last week that Isaac was married to Rebekah when he was 40. Which would have made Abraham 140 when Isaac married Rebekah. Jacob, as we'll see later, was born when Isaac was 60. That is still 15 years before Abraham died. So even though we're reading about Abraham's death and burial here at the beginning of Genesis chapter 25, before the birth of Jacob, we should understand that chronologically, Abraham actually did live after the birth of Jacob and Esau. He knew his grandsons until they were 15, and that's about the time that he died. Now, I think after having just read that passage, the timing of all these things is probably the least of your worries, right? For most people, even people who know the Bible well, the more shocking thing about what we just read is that Abraham, after Sarah's death, took another wife and had 6 more sons. Was that surprising to anyone? It feels like a shocking turn in this story. We know from before that Abraham had taken at least one concubine in the past. That was Hagar. You'll remember that back when he and Sarah were struggling to have faith in the promise of God, that they would have a child because they were barren and had been trying to have a child for many years, that in their lack of faith, Sarah had the idea that Abraham should sleep with her servant Hagar. And he took her up on the idea, all too eagerly, I would add, and had their son Ishmael. Ishmael was born before Isaac was. Caused a lot of drama with Abraham's wife, Sarah, even though it was kind of her idea. Now, Ishmael, even though he was the firstborn son of Abraham, he is not the chosen son of Abraham. God's promise was that Abraham and Sarah would have a child, so Isaac is the child of that promise. However, Ishmael was still blessed by God. And Abraham, as you'll recall from Genesis chapter 16, sent Hagar and Ishmael away because of the drama that it was causing within his family. Sarah couldn't stand having them around anymore, even though Abraham loved Ishmael. So he sent them away to the east. So even though he is quite old, it isn't too much of a surprise then that Abraham chooses to marry Keturah after Sarah's death. Now, he is amazingly, obviously, still very fertile, and he fathers 6 more sons with Keturah. Now, on a quick side note before we move on from this, I don't want you to understand this to diminish the miracle of Isaac's birth. Just because more children came after Isaac, they did not come from Sarah. The real miracle of Isaac's birth was that Abraham and his wife Sarah, who he loved dearly, had tried and tried and tried, and it was impossible for them to have a child until she was too old to bear any more children. Abraham was still able. And then the miracle was that she was able to give birth. Sarah then died, and Abraham was able to spend some time alone and then move on and have more children even in his old age. Remember, even though Abraham lived to 175, his father had lived to 205. And some of his not so distant relatives lived well over 400 years. So, with that in mind, maybe we shouldn't be too harsh on Abraham for thinking, I've got many decades left in my life. Why should I spend those decades alone? He took another wife, he had other children. But given Abraham's age, even after Sarah's death, he could have enjoyed up to 30 years, or maybe even a little bit more, being married to Keturah. Now, to be honest, we don't know really much of anything about this relationship. Keturah is only mentioned here and in a couple of repetitions of these genealogies that happen later on in the Bible. It is possible that she was a concubine of Abraham's before. In fact, she is described as being a concubine as well as described as being Abraham's wife in the Bible. This is just the messy family dynamic of Abraham. Maybe it makes you feel a little bit better about your family history, because this does feel like kind of a shocking development in a way. Because we would think, knowing what we know about God and the rest of the story, why on earth would Abraham need to do this? Why are there these extra children that came along after the birth of his son Isaac? Abraham knew full well that the promise of God had been fulfilled in him. So why did he go on to have another son or even more sons? Why did he do this? Should we be bothered by this? Well, before we get too bothered about it, consider what God told Abraham back in Genesis chapter 17. You remember from the story of Abraham before that God repeated this promise about making him a great nation several times. And in one of those repetitions, as God is renewing this covenant and establishing the covenant of circumcision, this is what God says to Abraham in Genesis 17, verse 4. God told him, "Behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations." That was part of the promise of God to him. Now, we can read that promise of God, understanding what we know about the Bible and understanding what we know about the story of Abraham. We can read that in sort of two ways. And there are lots of passages in the Old Testament that we read through this lens of a dual fulfillment. What that means is this. Because we know that the promise of God was that all nations of the world would be blessed through the line of Abraham. And we know that Jesus came from that line of Abraham. And for that reason, we would say that yes, Abraham is the father of a multitude of nations, because all nations are drawn into the grace of Jesus Christ. Any nation, any people can turn to Jesus in repentance and faith and be saved. And then they are grafted into this family of God, the family that God began with Abraham. So in that way, we could read Genesis 17:4 to say, God is establishing Abraham to be the father of a multitude of nations because of Jesus Christ. But then there's the more literal fulfillment, in a much more practical sense, by fathering Ishmael with Hagar and by fathering these other 6 sons with Keturah, all of whom had success and multiplied and became their own peoples. Abraham also, in a very literal sense, fathered many nations. And yet, as we were reminded, of all the nations that came from the line of Abraham, there's one nation that was a fulfillment of the promise. These other sons were not the children of promise. Isaac was. God's will for them was different than God's will for Isaac. God was doing something bigger. And this is one of the things that we can be reminded of as we go through this messy family passage today. The first thing that you can write down on your sheets is this: God's story is much bigger than any individual. God's story is much bigger than any individual. For many chapters in this book of our faith heritage, for many chapters, the focus has been on one man, Abraham. But over and over again, we are reminded of the fact that this is not just about him. This is the story of God making and upholding his covenant, his promises. It is the story of God working things out according to his own perfect will, generation after generation, decades, on centuries, on millennia. God is working out a very long-term plan. and Abraham was just a very small part of it. Likewise, you and I are a very small part of a very big story. And I don't say that to belittle our role or to make nothing of your life. No, I don't say that to make you feel unimportant. I point it out, as the Bible does, not in order to make your life feel small, but in order to bring light to just how big and wonderful and wide-stretching God's plans are. The idea is not meant to make little of you and your life, but rather to make much of God and what he is doing. Through much faith and many failures, Abraham served the Lord. But God's story was much bigger than Abraham. Abraham was meant to be the father of many nations, and all of those nations will bow before the Lord who is over them all. We all play a very small part in this very big plan of God. And that doesn't mean your life's not important. It means that it is important because it is a part of this incredible story that God is weaving throughout history. No individual is bigger or more important than the plan of God. In fact, even when our plans mess up and we make mistakes and we misunderstand, God's plan moves forward, which brings us back to Ishmael. Look back at the passage, Genesis chapter 25, verses 12 to 18, reminds us that as the story of Genesis shifts from Isaac to Jacob, it also is going to close the chapter on this other son, Ishmael. It says this: "These are the generations of Ishmael, Abraham's son, whom Hagar the Egyptian, Sarah's servant, bore to Abraham. These are the names of the sons of Ishmael, named in the order of their birth: Nebaioth, the firstborn of Ishmael, and Kedar, Abdeel, Mibsam, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Hadad, Tema, Jeter, Naphish, and Kedemah. These are the sons of Ishmael, and these are their names by their villages and by their encampments, 12 princes according to their tribes. These are the years of the life of Ishmael, 137 years. He breathed his last and died and was gathered to his people. They settled from Havilah to Shur, which is opposite of Egypt in the direction of Assyria. He settled over and against all his kinsmen." We should understand and be reminded of this morning. Ishmael was the product of a misunderstanding. Abraham and Sarah's faith had faltered, not thinking it was possible for God to give them a son. And thus, Ishmael was the child of Abraham, but not the child of promise. And as I mentioned before, even though Abraham loved Ishmael, he sent him and his mother Hagar away. And you may remember this episode from Genesis chapter 16, as Hagar and Ishmael are out in the wilderness, struggling to survive. They can't go back home. Sarah won't allow it. They're really having a hard time. And Ishmael is almost starving to death. So Hagar lays him beneath a tree. And she cries out to God and prays, like, "God, what am I supposed to do? This son of Abraham is here with me, and there's no way for us to live." And in that moment of desperation, she speaks to God at a place that she then called Be'er Lahai Roi, which means God has seen me. This is exactly the same place, you'll remember, that Isaac was praying to God when Rebekah arrived with the servant. His wife met him there at Be'er Lahai Roi. And then we were just told in that other passage about Abraham that it is also the place where he has settled with his people. The same place that Hagar prayed is the place where Isaac eventually settles, because it is the place where they are reminded God sees us, God understands us, God hears us and cares. Furthermore, as God continues speaking to Abraham and promising the birth of Isaac in Genesis chapter 17, he also adds this about Ishmael in Genesis chapter 17, verse 20. God said to Abraham, "As for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I have blessed him, and I will make him fruitful and multiply him greatly. He shall father 12 princes, and I will make him into a great nation." Seems odd, but here, because of Abraham's faithfulness to God, God chooses to also bless this other son Ishmael, to also make him into a great nation. And the genealogy that we just read in Genesis 25 proves this prophecy from Genesis 17:20 to be true. Ishmael, as God said, had 12 sons, and they became 12 princes over the people in their land. The God who is writing this big and overarching story across all of history, that God sees us, he hears us, he cares for us. He is, as we sometimes call him, El Roi, the God who sees. He understands and cares for us in our prayers, and he's willing to forgive our misunderstanding. Ishmael is proof of that. So the next thing that we should understand as we read about the will of God in this passage is that the will of God prevails despite our misunderstanding. We don't get what God is doing. Ishmael was a product of misunderstanding, but he wasn't forgotten or disregarded by God. No, he was still blessed. He still became a great nation and still had a legacy. Now, before we move on from Ishmael, I do want to make one interesting point. And there's not a lot of proof of this, but it is something that we should maybe notice. The passage that we just read might indicate that Ishmael also remained faithful to God. Remember, he was born to Abraham, and Abraham spoke often of the promises of this God of the universe that had spoken to him and made a covenant with him. Ishmael was aware of God's covenant with his father. Ishmael was also very aware that as his mother prayed, God heard and rescued her, and him, kept him from starving, established him, and made him a people. Ishmael knew the God of Abraham. So it's certainly possible that Ishmael was a man of faith that also followed God. We were also told this of Ishmael back in Genesis chapter 16, verse 12. God said, and this does not sound flattering, but God said, "He shall be a donkey of a man, his hand against everyone and everyone's hand against him, and he shall dwell over and against all his kinsmen." Maybe you'll recognize that phrase, "over and against his kinsmen," was precisely used in his genealogy that we just read in chapter 25. While this isn't great news for Ishmael, being a stubborn guy, it does prove in the long run to be true. And I think it's worth our consideration to think that it's possible that because Ishmael was faithful to God and because his people were not, that he was over and against them, that they had this familial conflict because he possibly knew of God's faithfulness to his father and God's faithfulness to him. That may have driven a wedge between him and his people, so that when he died, it is told of us, he stood over and against his people. As we read, he did attend his father Abraham's funeral. He was there alongside Isaac, which we know must have been very uncomfortable and awkward. And after living 137 years, we are told that like Abraham, Ishmael was gathered to his people. And we can talk about that phrase a little more during our discussion time at the end. But it is interesting to note that the same phrase is used for Ishmael as was used for Abraham. Now, generally speaking, we would understand that that phrase just means that a person died. But even back in these ancient times, before the word of God was fully revealed, there was an understanding that when you die, that is not the end. You go somewhere. There was this concept of an eternal soul. And to say that they died and were gathered to their people seems to indicate that Abraham and Ishmael went to the same place. So it's not definitive, but it does seem to indicate on some level faithfulness from this son of Abraham, who had in a way been cast out, not chosen. And again, the point of all this family drama is to show us that God is still working despite this. His story is bigger than us. He is able to work despite our misunderstanding. One of the hardest things about the Christian life sometimes is the fact that we don't know what God is doing with us sometimes, that we misunderstand, that we are clueless often to what God is doing or what he's accomplishing in us and through us, what he's developing in us, what all of our trouble and stress and strife could ever actually mean. sometimes we simply cannot understand. As the prophet Isaiah says in the passage that we opened our service with today in Isaiah 40:28, he said, "Have you not known? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable." We misunderstand because we are talking about the work and the will of God, the God of the universe, the creator of the ends of the earth. His understanding for us is unsearchable. And yet, he's doing something. He's accomplishing something. He is working out his will. So take comfort, dear Christian, even when you do not understand what in the world God is doing. He is doing something despite your misunderstanding. Let's continue on in Genesis chapter 25, verses 19 to 23. The story has now transitioned. The time of Abraham and Ishmael is over. Now we are talking about Isaac. It says, "These are the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham fathered Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean of Paddan Aram, the sister of Laban the Aramean, to be his wife. And Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife, because she was barren. And the Lord granted his prayer, and Rebekah his wife conceived. The children struggled together within her. And she said, 'If it is thus, why is this happening to me?' So she went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord said to her, 'Two nations are in your womb, and two peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other, the older shall serve the younger.'" So the story of Isaac and Rebekah getting together and falling in love from Genesis 24 last week, that happy little love story, is immediately eclipsed by difficulty and turmoil. In fact, we'll see a lot of the burdens of Abraham echoed in the life of Isaac. But here, right off the bat, in Isaac and Rebekah's relationship, they have to deal with this really painful issue of infertility. Just like his mother, Sarah, Isaac's wife also appears to be barren. And we know and understand that infertility is an incredibly painful thing for a couple to go through. It can really shake your faith. And for Rebekah and Isaac, it is difficult because of this promise of Isaac fathering this great nation. That promise is hovering over them. And they're saying, "God, if that's the promise, then why is nothing happening? Why are we unable to get pregnant?" We read just then that Isaac was 40 years old when he got married, and we'll read in just a couple of verses that he was 60 when his children were born. That's 20 years of trying to conceive. You can understand the pain and the struggle that is. It's just a painful way of God working out his will in their lives. So, as a result, Isaac prays deeply and fervently for a long time for his dear wife, and God answered his prayer. Rebekah conceives twins, even though she doesn't quite know it yet. But even before the twins are born, Rebekah can tell that something isn't normal. She feels this battle within her. And all you ladies who have had children in the room, you'll understand, and I've kind of watched this happen with my own children. It's weird for there to be a creature inside of you that can move and kick around, right? That disturbing feeling of the baby turning inside of you. It's very strange. Men, you may not understand that unless, you've had Taco Bell recently. That sort of battle within that happens sometimes, right? Something's not right inside of you. This is odd and different. And Rebekah recognizes this. So as she prays to God about this battle going on inside of her, God says and answers her prayer in kind of a mysterious way. He says, "There are two nations in your womb. One will be stronger than the other. The older son will serve the younger." That's a pretty mysterious message for God to give her in her distress. I want you to understand this whole situation is very tense. 20 years of infertility, and then there's this battle inside her before any of her children are even born. This feels like a real mess, and yet we're reminded of this. The next blank on your sheet is that the will of God prevails over our broken condition. These things that Isaac and Rebekah are experiencing are direct consequences of the fall and of sin that we read all the way back in Genesis chapter 3. You'll remember that after Adam and Eve sinned, that the curse came down from God. God said, "Cursed is the ground because of you." And then he pronounced the specific curse on Eve, saying that there will be pain in childbirth. It wasn't meant to be this hard. People were not meant to suffer through this long-term pain of infertility. That's not the way that it was meant to be. That's part of our broken condition. That is a consequence of sin in our world. Rebekah is suffering this because of sin. And then you'll also remember from early in Genesis that the sons that Eve did have, Cain and Abel, also battled against one another until one eventually killed the other. Again, the consequences of sin rear their ugly head from the beginning, and that echoes throughout the generations all the way here to Rebekah and her children. Like Cain and Abel, they also will be at odds with one another. And we know this all too well, but sin has wreaked havoc on our world. We experience all kinds of pain and tension and anguish as direct consequences of sin. And yet, that sin does not prevent God from working out his will. This is a wonderful and miraculous thing for us to consider. As much as we know and experience the awfulness of sin in the world, there's still a God that's able to do something throughout this. God is still working and moving. He isn't thwarted by these things that feel like they're ruining everything in our lives. God's plan is not stopped. God's plan and will does move forward. We know this to be true, that even against sin, God is not thwarted. And for Rebekah and Isaac, the family drama isn't over. Let's read on in Genesis chapter 25, verses 24 to 28. It says, "When her days to give birth were completed, behold, there were twins in her womb. The first came out red, all his body like a hairy cloak. So they called his name Esau. Afterward, his brother came out with his hand holding Esau's heel. So his name was called Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. When the boys grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man, dwelling in tents. Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob." So as Rebekah gives birth, they are surprised to see that there are twins, despite what God had already told her that may not have made sense to her at the time. But now, as she gives birth, suddenly she sees this is the battle that was going on inside of me. And these two twins, from their very first moments outside of the womb, are drastically different from one another. Esau is red and hairy. Now, perhaps it's because my two children were very white, very bald babies for a very long time. The thought of a red, hairy child coming out seems kind of disturbing to me personally, but sure, it could happen. A very strange-looking child has come out of this woman, a real Sasquatch of a baby, and that's fine. He's given the name Esau, which has ties to several Hebrew words. Some of them are similar to words for red, but really the name Esau is eventually tied to the names of the places where Esau's people will settle. We'll talk about this next week in depth, but he also will be called Edom, and his people later on in the Old Testament will be called the Edomites. That all comes from these Hebrew root words that they came up with for his name being Esau. And then there's Jacob. Now imagine how strange it must have been to have one baby come out and then the second baby holding on to that baby's foot as it's born. It's like a real barrel of monkeys situation. It's a very strange way for children to be born, right? There's a second child, and this one looks different and is inherently different. And again, from the very beginning, there is this strife and tension between these two brothers. Even the name given to Jacob, Yaakov as it is in Hebrew, typically means may God protect. But it also has ties to other Hebrew words. Akeb means heel, and he was grabbing onto his brother's heel as he was born. And Akab means to watch from behind. So then Jacob is sometimes interpreted as meaning one who grabs the heel or one who trips up someone else. And we will see next week, as we talk about a very difficult passage, that Jacob does indeed trip up his brother Esau. Now, as the twins grow, the division between them seems to grow also. Esau is an outdoorsy, skillful hunter, a man of the field, a true man's man, a real Gaston type for you Beauty and the Beast fans. Jacob, on the other hand, has a very different personality. He's reserved and quiet. He prefers indoor life. He's an inside cat kind of person. And it is for that reason that we see this really unflattering description of Isaac and Rebekah's parenting. They obviously are playing favorites with their children. And again, this is not something that we want to replicate in our own lives. Each of them would have purchased the sweatshirt that I happened to see at Target yesterday. You got the picture on the screen there. I couldn't believe that this exists. A real sweatshirt that marks you as the favorite child. Each of them would have purchased it for the two kids and be like, wait, I purchased that for this one. No, you purchased that for that one. No, this one's the favorite. No, that one's the favorite. There was this conflict in their family because of this favoritism going on. And this no doubt led to all sorts of trouble as the boys grew up. It is unhealthy for parents to favor one child over another. You don't want to be like Isaac and Rebekah in this case. But as the story unfolds, what we will continue to see is this. The will of God prevails over human preference, conflict, and tradition. Not only is the will of God able to prevail over our misunderstanding, not only is the will of God able to prevail over all the sin that has broken our world, the will of God prevails over the things that we want, the things that we would prefer, the fights that we have and who we would want to win, the tradition of how things should normally play out. The preference of Isaac and Rebekah for their children is petty, it's weak, and it will not interfere with what God has said. It doesn't matter that Isaac prefers Esau. The conflict that exists between them also will not derail this plan of God. Their internal familial struggles aren't going to stop God's plan. Plus, there's also this tradition. The oldest son is supposed to be the inheritor, the one who takes the authority of his father and passes it on to the next generation. There's a lot traditionally that goes into the inheritance of the older son. But God said from the beginning, in this case, it will be different. It doesn't matter that there's the tradition that Esau should be the inheritor. Jacob is the one who is the child of promise. Human tradition will not stand in the way of this. Over and over again, throughout this messy family history leading up to God establishing his people, Israel, we see this theme. God's will prevails above all. There have been 100 reasons in this story that God's will should have been thrown off. 100 sins that have taken place that should have messed up what we would think is the way that this should all play out. None of it's worked. In addition to that, you can think on the thousands and millions of things that have happened throughout human history that should be reasons that none of this should have played out the way it is. The people of Israel should have never been the people that they were. The Christ should have never come in the way that he came. The church that he established should have never survived all the things that have come against it. But none of those things have stopped the will of God. There have been so many things that should have gotten in the way, that should have wrecked this plan. But this is God that we're talking about. His will moves forward. Our sin doesn't stop it. Our preferences don't stop it. The way that we think and misunderstand doesn't stop it. God's will moves forward. God will establish his people, his way, for his purposes, ending in his glory. It is God's choosing, God's doing. His story is bigger than the flawed individuals that take part in it. And we may not always understand what God is doing or why, but he is God, and we are not. We will experience all kinds of conflict in this sin-broken world. We will have our preferences and traditions, but none of it will defeat what God is putting in place. His perfect will is playing out in history, and we're not going to stop it. So then, the best reaction that we can have as the people of God, grafted into this messy family that we read about in Genesis 25, is to pray as Jesus taught us, God, your kingdom come, your will be done. As much as there may be things about me that I feel like should get in the way of the will of God, the Christian position is to humbly say, God, set me aside. Let me be less, let you be more, let your will be done in my life. Don't bend your will to suit me, bend me to be suited to your will. That's the position that we take as believers. Our God, the God of our fathers, does as he pleases, and we would do well to join him in his work. Let's pray as we close for today. God, in these messy stories, the hope is that we can come out on the other side of these things, not with a shaken faith, but a faith that is made more steadfast, seeing how you have done great and amazing things to work out your will throughout all of this mess. And God, at the same time, let us be humbled. Let us seek your will above all things. God, don't let me be somebody who thinks that I can stand in the way of what you're doing. But instead, help me with joy to put myself, my preferences aside, to join in what you're doing, to be a part of the great things that you are working out through all of history. We love you and we thank you for this big will, this big vision, this big purpose that you have. And I pray that you'll help us to be a part of it. In your name we pray, amen. Let's stand and sing together as we close.